Palo Alto's housing debate has moved over to Cubberley Community Center after months of considering different conceptual designs for its redevelopment. Housing was all of a sudden introduced as one of the options. Shinadi, can you kind of fill us in on how that happened?
Yeah, well, this has been a multi-year process for anybody who hasn't been following, and it's just recently kind of resuscitated. The City Council talked about it this week, and basically the discussion focused on what should we look at in our environmental analysis for Cubberley. And as you mentioned, the housing thing that was recently introduced into the conceptual plans, but it's sort of been part of the conversation for a while. You know, we had resident Stephanie Munoz who proposed it many times during public comments. Alison Cormack mentioned it last October, or when she was a council candidate. So it's new-ish, but as far as planning for actual Cubberley, like on the council level, it is pretty new, and it's quickly become by far the most controversial aspect of a process that for the past few months we've been hearing is going swimmingly well.
Does the pushback against the housing proposal sort of fall along predictable lines as they usually do in Palo Alto, or is there anything different about the reaction to these proposals?
It was a little bit different because Cubberley, as you know, is a community center. So it's got recreational uses, playing fields. They're proposing a gym for it, that kind of stuff. And so on the council level, it was a little bit familiar in that those who favor growth wanted more housing. But when you zoom out outside the council, we had Parks and Recreation Commission, which usually doesn't opine on how much housing, what publicly facility zoned properties should be rezoned to, that kind of stuff. They came out with a very fierce memo saying no housing on city land, just like the week before this discussion. I find that highly unusual. There was a ton of speakers, like 40 of them at this week's meeting from both camps. The people you would associate with pro-housing positions all kind of uniformly said, let's explore housing. But those who said no to housing are not necessarily like the slow growth folks. It's also people who are saying things like, yes, we do need housing, but housing is also going to require more recreational opportunities. And so, yes, housing, but not at this particular site. Let's reserve it for recreation and things of that nature.
And so this week, the council decided, though, to include the housing option as something that they would possibly explore. So what's the next step with that? What's going on from there?
Yeah, I mean, it was a 6-1 vote, which is kind of misleading because it implies that there was some kind of consensus on what's going to happen. And it was a bit of a troubling discussion if you've been following Cubberley for years, as Elena and I have. Because first of all, it was clear that the city council, even though they were compromising, that they had very different positions. It's also clear that the council and the school board are completely different scales. So it's become this weird bureaucratic Rubik's Cube where you don't know what one side's going to come up with. And once they do come up with it, we don't know how the other side, which, by the way, owns like 80% of the site, is going to think about. So, and we've already, I think Elena was here as well in 2012, 2014 at least, when they were renegotiating a lease for Cubberley. And things got pretty contentious. Like, they couldn't decide on things. This was when Kevin Skelly was just completing his superintendent stint. And then Max McGee came in and they came up with a new agreement. And things were pretty hairy and dicey for a while. They came up with this 5-year lease deal that's going to expire at the end of this year. And during this 5-year period, things were kind of honky-dory. We're going to come up with a master plan. But now that it's expiring, and if people who heard this Monday's discussion may have heard some hints of frustrations starting to bubble up. So the 6-1 vote makes it seem like, things are looking pretty good, but there's some clouds on the horizon.
Maybe you can give some background on the site. What does the city own? What does the school district own? Just for people who don't have the knowledge of what's going on with that site.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a 35-acre site, and the city owns 8 acres, kind of the area closest to Piazzas, that plaza. School district owns the rest of it, and they also own about 7 acres, what's known as the San Antonio, 525 San Antonio Road, and Greendale, which are adjacent. It almost looks like a panhandle extension of Cubberley. And so those 2 properties are not part of the lease, but the 27 acres at Cubberley, the school district leases to the city. under a lease that's been on for decades. And again, it's going to expire at the end of this year. And it's expected to get renewed while they hash things out. But again, listening to this week's meeting, it's not clear whether this renewal is going to go as smoothly as expected. But that's kind of the relationship. School district owns most of it, and the district just owns 8 acres close to the piazza.
What are you hearing from the school district?
Well, it kind of feels like we're back to where we started in a way. Of the district has always said, we want to preserve that land for future use, which could be a school, could be something else. Now they're talking about teacher housing, but they really don't know or haven't decided yet or done the legwork of figuring out what they need to use there. And so they are moving at a much slower pace. I talked to a few school board members last week who just said, and the superintendent, don't feel a ton of urgency around it. The city council can move at their own pace and go through their own process, and that doesn't affect ours. Only one trustee, Shanik Durop, felt sort of a sense of like, we got to move on this now, especially related to housing, given teacher housing is a pressing issue in the Bay Area. Other school districts are moving forward with or have moved forward with projects, including in Mountain View School District right here. So he felt like he acknowledges that there are concerns about safety and traffic and all those things that come with building new housing, but that to foreclose the option before it's even been looked at would be sort of premature and unfair to what the district wants to use that land for. So no movement though. So a lot of sort of discussion, not a lot of decision and movement on the school district's behalf.
And just to add, I think this is one of the reasons why I'm getting such a deja vu feeling from 5 years ago. Back then, it was the same exact thing.
Right.
The school district was saying, this Cubberley's falling apart. It's it's very dilapidated. It needs fixing, and you don't want to fix a building that you're going to be replacing, obviously. And so, if the school board doesn't do anything, nothing will be done, and it's just going to continue falling apart. And there's going to be these high maintenance costs. And the master plan, which everybody considered a huge success, has been this wonderful process. School board and city both agreed. It would become kind of useless if school board doesn't take any action or if it doesn't give any kind of clear direction. And so 5 years ago, we were hearing the same kind of different pace thing, and it took the expiration of the lease and some very kind of big decisions by the council, like dropping the covenant not to develop, which is a whole other issue that was controversial then. They had to kind of, put the school district's feet to the fire just to get a kind of response. And then they hammered out this 5-year lease extension. And we're getting to that point again here where the extension is about to expire. There's this master plan that everybody agrees it's good, but just because you approve a master plan by overwhelming vote doesn't mean anything if that plan, nothing gets done with it. It just goes, on a
Say
shelf.
it did get approved. Where's the funding coming from it?
It's a big answer
That's a
that I think everyone's... And I don't know, just when I was talking to Don Austin back when I was writing about the Cubberley plan, and I asked him a question, and he didn't want to kind of engage in it at all. He's like, it's way too early. And I feel like because the school board, and Elena can correct me, they don't need a school at this moment, they want to preserve their option.
Yeah.
So why would they go out for a huge bond right now
Right.
or a huge tax measure when there may be an actual need, which is a totally reasonable position? And on the city side, how do you raise a bunch of funding to build a bunch of facilities that everybody wants if you don't own the land and if you don't have a buy-in from the landowner, which is the school district? So again, a 6-1 vote sounds like good news. Great planning process by Concordia. Everyone loves it. But the rubber's going to meet the road in the next few months, starting with the joint session between our beats.
It will be a telling sort of illustration of the relationship between the school district and the city, who I think historically have sort of struggled to collaborate on this and many other issues. They have the city school liaison committee, which is sort of a subgroup of council members and school board members, but they don't have any actual power. We go to those meetings sometimes. I think they're talking about Cubberley next
They are next
week.
Wednesday morning, yeah.
So yeah, I think it's an example of just sort of how that relationship plays out for better or for worse.
What were some of the housing options that emerged during, was it last month that they came forward with these options?
May 9th was a community
Okay.
meeting where the public first saw these 4 housing options. They range from 32 units to 164 units. Options 1 and 2 have the least housing, and in these cases it's completely reserved for the school district site. One of them in the San Antonio area, the other one would have that one, and also a 4-story building on the school district side. The other 2 options, which have 112 and 164 units respectively, would use city site. they would both create like another apartment building, and the one with 164 units would also add 2 stories to Cubberley. So those are the 2 options that the council kind of clashed over. There were some 4-3 votes. Ultimately, the compromise was going to the 112. So in a sense, it was good news that the factions on the council were able to compromise, but back to our previous point, all these compromises useless if this, if they don't get a buy-in from the school district.
And with some of the pushback from the Parks Commission was that the housing would take over valuable space that could be used for recreation, because it looked like in some of the plans that it wouldn't take over additional space because they could always go up instead of out.
Yes, and that's actually something that was the counterpoint to the Parks and Recreation's position. They're basically saying that recreation space is very scarce and very valuable, becoming more so as the city continues to grow. The city just made a bunch of zoning changes that the hope is will spur a lot more housing. And so their point is, we need this land. The counterpoint is you could have these recreation opportunities, add housing without eliminating any of them. Look at the JCC, and there's other examples of housing and recreation and sharing space. And of course, the counterpoint to this counterpoint is if you're going to build up this valuable public facility land, add more recreational amenities, add more, studios, gyms, all the other kind of stuff that the entire community will need, as opposed to reserve it for 50, 60, 70 units. So it's not going to get resolved for a while, and I have a feeling that, even after the EAR gets released, this debate will resurface, because the only thing the council agreed is that this should be evaluated in the analysis, but whether it actually becomes part of the plan depends on many things the council cannot control.
And we should bring up that they're looking at the housing be affordable housing, teacher housing, possibly city staff housing, not housing for the masses, just.
Yeah,
Okay.
they haven't completely figured out what kind of housing it will be. They just
Okay.
they're just looking at concepts now, but affordable senior housing or just affordable housing for workforce. Those are kind of the main things people have been
Okay.
talking about.
Okay, anything you guys want to add?
Well, I think the Wednesday morning meeting is going to be very
Mhm.
interesting of the liaison committee, because I think one of the things that has hampered negotiations in the past is it was all kind of in the backdoor negotiations between top city and top, district staff, and it was very contentious, and things didn't become public till way later. I think there's more of an effort now to have the liaison committee become more involved in kind of sharing information, and I think the tone of discussion is kind of in danger of getting askew a little bit. Just this week, we've heard Liz Niss talk about how disappointed she is that school board members aren't at that meeting. I should
Even
point
though
out,
one was.
yeah, the board president was for much of the meeting. She was there, and we had Tom Du Bois basically saying, "Let's not assume we're just going to extend this lease after this year. Let's tie it to some kind of funding, development fund." So the tone is kind of shifting. So it'll be interesting to see next week at this committee meeting if they reconcile their differences and hopefully create a path for a more fruitful conversation when the full board and city council meet in the fall.
Okay. Well, that wraps up today's Behind the Headlines. If you want to stay up to date on Palo Alto news, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or go to paloaltoonline.com. Thanks.